Welcome to Florida.
That is the voice of New York Times best-selling author and award-winning environmental reporter Craig Pittman. My name is Chad Scott, and this is Welcome to Florida, and I'm going to give a little spoiler alert here. The way Craig and I record this podcast, or produce this podcast anyways, we do the interview, and then we wrap up, and then after that, we come back and record the introduction. So Craig and I have already spoken to Michael Butler, history professor at Flagler College, about today's topic, Martin Luther King Jr. in St. Augustine, this period, 1963, 1964. And Craig, there's about 12 or 15 episodes in my top 5 episodes, and this one's going in it.
It's great, and it's a story that not nearly enough people know about. And I have to mention, I stumbled on it through a work of fiction. I was reading a novel that was set in St. Augustine by Connie Mae Fowler called Sugar Cage, that talks about Martin Luther King visiting St. Augustine for protest. And I thought, well, that can't be true. She must have made that up. And I started looking into it, and holy cow, it was absolutely true. It really happened. And a whole lot of other stuff happened too.
Yeah, well, and to think about this, you grew up in Florida.
Yeah.
Not long after this period of, again, we're not talking about Reconstruction.
No.
We're not talking about the Civil War. We're not talking about Andrew Johnson, and this is not ancient history. Mm-mm. People were alive during this.
I was 4 years old. I was 4 years old when this stuff was happening. I didn't know about it.
And there are a lot of reasons for that, and we will get into some of those reasons. I'm so proud, I guess is the way to put it. We have a number of episodes in the archives about Black history in Florida, going all the way back to episode number 2, American Beach.
American Beach, yeah.
The Ku Klux Klan in Florida, lynching in Florida, Mary McLeod Bethune, Zora Neale Hurston, Harriet Beecher Stowe, America's Most Racist Sheriff, Lost African American Cemeteries. All of those are in the archives. If you want to go back and listen to them, I suggest that you do. And just last week's episode, this is kind of a deep dive.
The two kind of bookend, don't they?
Right. The Beatles were in Jacksonville and were in Florida in 1964. While this is the backdrop of what's happening. We talked last week, specifically about the Beatles and sort of skipped across the surface of some of these topics. But today we are going to dive in with both feet. Again, our guest is Michael Butler. He's a history professor at Flagler College. He has written a book called Beyond Integration, The Black Freedom Struggle in Escambia County, Florida, 1960 to 2000. This is obviously not Escambia County, but he's been involved in researching this and writing about this history for an incredibly long time. This is one of the great hidden stories of Florida history, of American history, of civil rights history, and Michael's going to bring it to us in full flavor here on this episode.
Absolutely. Yeah. Let's get to it. This is a story I think a lot of people in Florida don't know anything about. How did you first hear about Martin Luther King being arrested in St. Augustine?
Well, one of my favorite books about the movement was a local study that I ran across when I was in graduate school. The title was Racial Change and Community Crisis. It was written by David Colburn, a very well-known and esteemed historian who retired from the University of Florida. And it emphasized the St. Augustine struggle. Outside of that, though, Craig, I didn't know as much about it as I do now, because that was part of the deal with me being hired at Flagler College. They wanted to have someone who specialized in civil rights history and could branch out a little bit more into the local history. So what I have learned is that St. Augustine has a unique place in what scholars call the master narrative of the movement. So as time has passed, I had a foundation for what happened in St. Augustine, but what happened in St. Augustine was never part of the quote unquote master narrative, right? Which is from Montgomery, 1955 through the assassination of Dr. King. In between, St. Augustine is often left out. And one of the questions that has driven my research and teaching since I've been here is why?
Yeah. Well, I went to school at Auburn, born and raised in Wisconsin, and I've lived in Florida for 12 years now. And yes, my previous notions of civil right were Montgomery, Selma, Birmingham, Jackson, Mississippi, the Freedom Summer and the bus rides, and Atlanta, and then Memphis. At no point was St. Augustine ever mentioned in there until I read Craig's Florida and found this, incredible, and it's not isolated. It's not a blip here. This isn't manufactured history. I mean, it was central to this narrative, like you talked about, and which has been excluded. Why was it excluded?
Well, I think first and foremost, Chad, it was central because Dr. King was here when he received news that the Civil Rights Act had passed Congress.
Yeah, boom.
Right? The infamous photograph of what happened at the Monston Motor Lodge was on the front page of Washington newspapers the morning the vote was held in the Senate on the Civil Rights Act. So why, the question of why, Chad, is the question that I've really been asking every time I have a chance to meet people who are involved in the movement. And I think what I have discovered is that both SCLC, the national movement, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, right, which was Dr. King's organization, which organized the St. Augustine struggle, and local St. Augustinians in the immediate aftermath, both sides wanted to forget about the campaign. They wanted to erase it from memory because neither side saw it as a victory or a memory worth commemorating. For SCLC, they always wanted to exit a community with some sort of compromise, a compromise that entailed a biracial committee, a compromise that would allow African Americans and whites to live together in the aftermath of that decision. We didn't have that in St. Augustine. The Civil Rights Act was passed, SCLC left, and as Dr. King said, there were some communities that had to bear the cross for all others. St. Augustine was one of those places.
Well, for our listeners who have no knowledge of this, or maybe even the scant, tell us what happened in St. Augustine. It started in 1963, didn't it?
It absolutely did. As a matter of fact, Craig, as historians kind of dig deeper into the civil rights movement at the local level, what we realize is that the common freedom song refrain is true. Freedom is a constant struggle, right? So we can say it, quote unquote, started in 1963, but it starts with the local dentist named Dr. Robert Hayling. Dr. Hayling wanted to mobilize the young people of St. Augustine because they wanted to be mobilized. As the movement is spreading throughout the South, St. Augustine was not immune to those trends and those demonstrations. Long story short, Dr. Hayling, because of his activities, was nearly lynched at a major Klan rally that happened just on the outskirts of St. Augustine. He was an NAACP representative. The organization removed him from a leadership position, and he turned to SCLC as really his only hope. So SCLC decided that after the 1963 Birmingham campaign, after the March on Washington, after the promise of a Civil Rights Act, that St. Augustine would be the next campaign that they organized. And that's what happened in late 63 as we turn into 64. What happened is that St. Augustine experienced the same thing that so many other Southern communities did. And make absolutely no mistake about it, during this period and beyond, St. Augustine was Southern in culture, as was most of the state of Florida, as y'all well know.
Yeah.
But ground zero for late 63, early 64 civil rights campaigns was St. Augustine, Florida.
Yeah, and I still remember this line distinctly, and I've repeated it many times from Florida, Craig's book about how, where he mentioned the Martin Luther King Jr. quote, where he said St. Augustine was as lawless as any place he'd been. And he'd been, you think of Mississippi, you think of Alabama, but it was St. Augustine, Florida, that he said, this is the worst. How bad, the cliched question, how bad was it, the racial acrimony towards African Americans there?
Well, one of the things, Chad, that I've had the great pleasure of doing in being an expert of sorts, I guess, on this topic, is I've had the chance to meet Andrew Young. I've had the chance to meet Willie Bolden. I've had the chance to meet Dr. Hayling and Hank Thomas and a lot of these freedom fighters. And one of the things Andrew Young told me that I'll never forget is that St. Augustine was the only SCLC campaign where medical expenses were higher than legal expenses.
Wow.
The organization spent more money on medical care for people who were beaten up and hospitalized than they did bail and attorney's fees. Not Selma, not Birmingham, St. Augustine. That's how bad it was.
And of course, the authorities weren't stepping in and protecting people. They just let it happen.
As a matter of fact, Craig, the authorities were meeting on a daily basis to strategize on how they could shut this movement down. So not only are they not intervening, they're actually assisting in the efforts to stop the local movement. Things so violent here and so dangerous here that after Dr. King came to St. Augustine the first time, he wanted Andrew Young to stop the movement. The fear was that St. Augustine, for a lot of reasons, right? Primarily because adults wanted to participate in the. So night marches were a common feature of this struggle. And it's one of the only cities where night marches occurred. Now, for all of the listeners and potential visitors who have been to St. Augustine, you know that downtown at night is still relatively dark. It was worse during this period. So every time they would turn a corner, every time that they would walk from Lincolnville, our historically segregated, at that time, historically segregated neighborhood, to the downtown area, they did not know if, when they turned a corner, if they were going to be met by club-wielding Klansmen or if they were going to encounter snipers that were perched in the tall buildings. So King actually told Andrew Young, St. Augustine has the potential to undermine the Civil Rights Act. We've got to minimize our activities there. Of course, the opposite actually happened, but those were the stakes in St. Augustine. It was so dangerous that Dr. King was afraid that if violence consumed St. Augustine, that some of the congressmen who might have been on the fence with the Civil Rights Act would say, we can't enact this law right now, or we're going to have St. Augustines across the South.
Andrew Young himself got beaten down during one of the marches, didn't he?
Yeah, Andrew Young, for the listeners who may not be aware, Andrew Young was one of the lieutenants, as Dr. King called them, of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, right? Hosea Williams was the other. The way that Dr. King operated was that he had these two crucial components of SCLC. I kind of, when I explain it to students, I say it's like a head coach who has an offensive coordinator and a defensive coordinator, right? Hosea Williams is the offensive coordinator. He's the one who is, let's mobilize and damn the consequences. We're going to organize a city. Andrew Young was more of the politician. He was more conservative. He was the defensive coordinator. So, of course, Dr. King is going to send the more cautious, the more deliberate Andrew Young to shut it down. And he was tricked into leading a demonstration to the city plaza. And as you mentioned, Craig, it was the first and only time in his life that he was beaten to a point of unconsciousness. And it occurred right here near the plaza in our city. And after that, of course, Andy Young said, this is, we have to make our stand. We're not going to cut and run. Instead of St. Augustine being the place where we are going to fear the movement will be undermined, that we're actually going to use St. Augustine as validation for why the Civil Rights Act has to pass now. So it's really interesting that the city played a role within the way SCLC thought about the strategy that went into developing the movement.
And Dr. King's, the house he was staying in, did it burn or was he shot at? I can't remember which. Or
Great
both.
question. It was actually shot into, and there's a deeper story here. Again, back to Chad's question about how bad was it. In St. Augustine, as in many other places, right, but particularly St. Augustine, Dr. King stayed in the same house in consecutive nights. And the reason was not for his own safety. He did not want to put the residents with whom he was staying in harm's way, right? So very few people knew about where Dr. King stayed on a night-to-night basis. There's only a tight inner circle of people who knew. Well, there's a famous photograph of Dr. King pointing to a bullet hole in a window. That was St. Augustine Beach. For me, the most insidious part of that photograph, Craig, is that somebody knew he was staying there and fired into the house before the night he was supposed to stay there. So again, that reflects St. Augustine's a small town, and the danger, the news spreading, the organized resistance undermines any sense of security that SCLC planned for. So yeah, his home was shot into. And that was not an uncommon tactic here that white supremacist groups use to intimidate and harass local activists.
Was St. Augustine a tourist destination at this point? We think of downtown St. Augustine today, it's full of people, all these shops and bars and restaurants, and the trolley tours and the walking tours and obviously 1963, 1964 is going to be different, but at this time, was it tourism, or was this just a fishing village still?
It was a little bit of both. It was coming into its own as a tourist destination, right? At least in terms of mid-20th century, post-World War II tourism. It was absolutely that. I think that that's one of the reasons that the stakes were so high. That, when coupled with the fact that St. Augustine was getting ready to celebrate its quadricentennial.
Yeah.
Right? St. Augustine has always had a little chip on its collective shoulder because we're not in the history books, right? My good friend, Dr. Tom Graham, says that when the Pilgrims had the first Thanksgiving, St. Augustine was undergoing urban renewal. So there's a little bit of, like I said, there's a chip on the collective shoulder that we have not gotten our fair shake as the quote unquote nation's oldest city. Well, with the 400th anniversary of the town approaching, with Lyndon Johnson, who was vice president at the time, visiting the city, with the federal government pouring hundreds of thousands of dollars into this, St. Augustine thought, wow, this is going to be our opportunity. We're the first American city to celebrate its 400th anniversary. We're finally going to make it into the history books. And then you have what they call, quote unquote, that mess occurring with Black activism, ruining the party, so to speak.
Radicals.
So, absolutely. The radicals, the outside agitators, all of those tropes.
Yeah.
So did tourism play a role? Yes. Did their historical identity play a role? Absolutely. And I think that's one of the reasons that in the aftermath, the city wanted to forget about it.
Yeah. Well, and in fact, I interviewed Dr. Haling, and he said that was the reason, that was the thing they were using as a reason to start the protest, was basically the Black community saying, you guys are going to make a lot of money here. Why don't you help the Black community help you celebrate and get some of that tourist cash as well? And the white leadership in town was like, we don't want to hear from you.
You're absolutely right. It not only is it that we want to get some of that tourist cash, we want to be a part of the planning. We want to elevate our history. How come there are no African American representatives on any of these planning committees? How come there are no African Americans in significant city jobs? So as the 400th approach, you're absolutely right, Craig. And this is a familiar civil rights strategy. How can the city accept federal funds and continue to segregate after receipt of those funds?
Yeah.
Right. And that was the strategy. They were told that they would be listened to, that their demands would be acknowledged after LBJ came to town. And that just simply didn't happen. And you're absolutely right. That's where Dr. Haling said, and I quote, we were hoodwinked and it would not happen again.
Yeah. Well, and wasn't there some meeting where they showed up prepared to present their demands and they were met with a tape recorder? And
that was the day after LBJ's appearance, where they were told, we will, if you don't boycott LBJ's appearance and banquet that was actually held here on what is now the campus of Flagler College in the dining room, that we will invite you to the event, which they did. They were kept in a segregated balcony and were not allowed to interact with anyone there. They actually had Secret Service guards preventing anyone from interacting with them. And they were told the next day we would give you an audience with city leaders and a federal representative. And the city leaders and that federal representative was a secretary and a tape recorder.
Wow. So bad faith bargaining all up and down the line. All right. So set the stage for the Monson Motor Lodge story, which is sort of the central event that, as you mentioned, the picture wound up on the front page of the Washington Post.
Yeah, the Monson Motor Lodge incident is sort of the pinnacle of the local movement, and it's often the image that any interested historians or interested readers know about St. Augustine. Sometimes it's all they know about St. Augustine. James Brock was both the owner of the Monson Motor Lodge, which was one of the most prominent hotels that was located at that time on our bayfront. This actually, for listeners today, it's where Hilton currently sits. Okay. And the Monson Motor Lodge, it was also symbolic because that is the place where every morning the city mayor, the city chief of police, the county sheriff, and the leader of the quote unquote ancient city gun club, which was nothing more than the Catholic Klan, where they met every morning to discuss what happened yesterday, what they're going to plan for today. So it was central in that it is symbolic because this is where local leaders met to try to undermine the movement. To put it on, to add to that, James Brock was also the president of the Florida Hotel Owners Association.
Wow.
So it's a symbolic strike against segregation in hotels in Florida as a whole. So on the morning of June 18, the afternoon of June 18, actually, a LC member, a white man named Al Lingo, checked in. At the same time that this episode occurred, a group of Jewish rabbis, almost 40, knelt in prayer in the parking lot of the Monson Motor Lodge. Brock just lost it. He cried. At the same time, Lingo entered the pool, and he invited friends who were waiting on the invitation, who were African American, to jump the hedgerows and enter the pool with him. Brock heard the splashes, was demanding that police arrest the rabbis that were on site, heard the splashing, turned to the pool, saw black people in it, basically sprints to the pool, picks up a bottle of muriatic acid and pours it into the pool. The imagery of that moment was of a white man in sunglasses pouring acid in a pool with a black face, not understanding what was going on and literally screaming in terror. That became the face of segregation for many legislators, for many in the Senate, the next day when they voted to pass the Civil Rights Act. That photograph, in my opinion, guys, is one of the most impactful of the movement. I mean, it goes with the Birmingham photograph of the young man being beaten by a German Shepherd, a police dog. It is tantamount to the Selma March photograph, Bloody Sunday. It tells the story both of the local movement, but also of the national ramifications of what often happened at the local movement. Because the civil rights movement is not a story of people like Dr. King deciding that segregation's bad and using his charisma and persuasive nonviolent arguments to bring change. No. One of the things that picture allows me to express to students is that the reason that SCLC's here, the reason that Dr. King's here, the reason that Andrew Young is here, the reason that the photographers were in place to capture that moment was because of the bravery of the local people who organize and bring change that they did not understand they had the power to bring at the national level. And the legacy of that change still covers all of our civil rights today.
Mm-hmm. The very next day, I think that's important. The very next day after this incident, the Civil Rights Act passes after having been filibustered in Congress for months. So it wasn't Medgar Evers, it wasn't Emmett Till, it wasn't the March on Washington, it wasn't I Have a Dream, it wasn't King's assassination, it wasn't police dogs in Birmingham, it wasn't Bloody Sunday in Selma. It was St. Augustine that was the straw that broke the camel's back in the Senate. And that is almost unknown in U.S. history. That assault should be, in the same breath as those other well-known assaults and assassinations and speeches I mentioned. Who took the picture?
That was an Associated Press photograph. That's part of the strategy, Chad, of the movement. And, one of the things about the civil rights movement that I find so incredibly interesting is that nothing was done without a well thought out plan and an objective. So the Associated Press, who were already here, right, and by the way, were being attacked by white people on the beach when wade-ins occurred, right? So the local mobs had actually turned on reporters. They turned on journalists. Okay.
Sounds familiar.
So, the Associated Press was there, and they were tipped off that there's going to be an integration of this pool. Of course, they didn't know what would transpire. As a matter of fact, Andrew Young told me that when all of that was happening and they saw James Brock pouring the acid in the pool, King looked at him and he wasn't happy about it. He said, "We just ruined that man's life."
Although you could argue the man himself ruined it.
Absolutely.
Taking that action.
Oh, absolutely, Craig. But I think that one story is really interesting because the stakes are so high, right, at that time.
Mm-hmm.
And who is King thinking about? He's thinking of the person who's
the oppressor.
Yeah, he's thinking of the oppressor. If that's not practicing what you preach, I don't know what is.
Yeah, remarkable sympathy. Amazing. I've never heard that before. Wow.
Brock also had King arrested too, didn't he?
Yeah, that was actually before this because of its symbolism, Craig. That when Dr. King decided that he was going to, just like in Birmingham, that he would be arrested for integrating for moral purposes a segregated facility. It was the Monson Motor Lodge for all the reasons that we discussed. So he was literally arrested on the steps of the Monson Motor Lodge. And those steps are still preserved and exhibited at the Hilton on the Bayfront.
Yeah. So he was, what was he trying to do? Was he trying to come in and just have a meal?
He was. The Monson Motor Lodge had a dining area, and he wanted to come in and have a cup of coffee, wanted to integrate. And James Brock's response was the same that many other African Americans had faced. It was, you can't do that. It's illegal. I'm not here to change the law. I'm here to uphold the law. Part of the interesting part of St. Augustine is that James Brock and the Monson Motor Lodge went from being this establishment that white people defended, even met at, to after the Civil Rights Act passed, because the law changed, he integrated, and his hotel was firebombed by the Ku Klux Klan.
Wow.
So he was really in a damned if you do, damned if you don't scenario. And, Andrew Young, as he told me, history is bigger than any one person. Some people had, like Brock, the worst moment of your life forever captured, and that doesn't tell the whole story. Now, Brock remained defiant to the very end that he believed in segregation. But Andrew Young, on his documentary Crossing in St. Augustine that tells this story, apologized. He apologized for all of the despair and problems that the movement caused individual people in St. Augustine, foremost among them Jimmy Brock. And I found that interesting. But again, y'all are right in terms of people just don't realize how important St. Augustine was in the national narrative. And the reason that we don't know more about it is because SCLC did not view it as a total victory because there was no compromise. There was just a law. And the local people here look at it as sort of a black eye on their tourist-centric reputation. It's only recently, I would say in the past 10 or 15 years, that the city has finally come to grips with what this meant for the nation as a whole and have begun to commemorate several different elements from that period.
Well, so what happened to King when he was arrested? Where was he taken?
He was taken to the St. Johns County jail. The arrest of King, again, it's a minor story, but it just it gets you into the bitterness and just I call it the abject meanness of what was going on in St. Augustine. There's a famous photograph of Dr. King in the back of a sheriff's vehicle with a police dog in the back seat with him. Now, the only thing Dr. King was really afraid of, he wasn't afraid of dying. He wasn't afraid of his public reputation being smeared. He was definitely afraid of German Shepherds, police dogs. And, after you saw what they did to people in places like Birmingham, I understand.
Mm-hmm.
Somehow L.O. Davis knew this. L.O. Davis was the sheriff of St. Johns County at the time. So when King was arrested for trying to integrate the Monson Motor Lodge and was put in the back of a county deputy's vehicle, L.O. Davis opened up the door and instructed one of their canines to jump in with him. So just out of spite, knowing that King was not a fan of police dogs, they did that the entire ride to the county jail. So there are pictures, if you Google it, of St. Augustine, Martin Luther King, or Martin Luther King, German Shepherd. He's smiling because the old phrase, never let them see you sweat, was it was a reality for SCLC leaders, but it was also terrifying for him. And the county law enforcement knew that, and that's why they did it.
And how long was he in jail?
He was only in jail for, I want to say, 2 days. It wasn't long. He bailed out. It was long enough for him to write some correspondences to draw attention to what was happening in St. Augustine, because that was the second time that Dr. King came to St. Augustine. And that was after the decision was made to make St. Augustine the focus of what is going on with the Civil Rights Act, instead of trying to keep the movement on the down low and even stop activity. So he was not in jail for a long period, but it was long enough to draw attention to what was going on, because that was part of the SCLC playbook. Create a crisis, a justifiable moral crisis, depend on a hostile, shall we say, response by local people, publicize it, national outrage demands that the federal government do something to prevent it, right? So that was part of sort of the game plan that SCLC had stumbled into with Birmingham, and they applied it in St. Augustine as well. So yeah, it was I'm going to be arrested because the movement here needs attention, to draw outrage to the fact that the Civil Rights Act may not pass through the Senate. Remember, the Civil Rights Act remains to this day the reason for the longest filibuster in U.S. Senate history.
Did Dr. King wind up testifying in federal court about this somehow?
Yeah, he did. There are so many different sub-stories to this. And one of the sub-stories, and I think it's one of the most important things that happened as a result of the St. Augustine movement, the city claimed that the night marches were too dangerous, so they put a stop to them. They outlawed them. They made them illegal. SCLC actually filed a federal lawsuit against the city, saying that it infringed upon the participants' First Amendment rights, right? Mm-hmm. So it went to freedom of speech, freedom of demonstration. It went into the federal court. Judge Brian Simpson was the presiding officer. And yes, Andrew Young was actually the named complainant. It was Andrew Young versus L.O. Davis, the sheriff of St. Johns County. And long story short, there were many people who were deposed, including Dr. King. And that's where we learned that the chief of police and the county sheriff had deputized known Klansmen to serve as auxiliary police to enforce these statutes.
Holy cow.
Yeah. So it's not hyperbole to say law enforcement was deputizing Klansmen to help them enforce segregated statutes. And King testified on behalf of what SCLC witnessed during those demonstrations and night marches.
How much time in totality did King spend in St. Augustine?
Fewer than 10 days. It was not that long. Yeah, he only made 2 visits to St. Augustine, but those days were
They were pretty eventful. Yeah.
And St. Augustine remains the only place in Florida where Dr. King was ever arrested, right?
Are there any, you mentioned that the steps are still there from the Monson Motor Lodge where he was arrested. Are there any plaques or
Oh, absolutely. There are several mementos that are preserved now in and around St. Augustine that reflect on this movement. I think one of the most important is the actual fingerprints of Dr. King when he was arrested. And those are housed at, I'm going to give a shout out to the Lincolnville Cultural Center and Museum. They are dedicated. The people there are great. I urge listeners that when they're in St. Augustine, yeah, you're going to get the Spanish history. You're going to get the pirate boat tour. But you owe it to yourself to go to what was our formerly segregated, vibrant Black community. The Lincolnville Cultural Center showcases that history. They have the piano that Ray Charles played here at the Florida School for the Deaf and Blind. And they have the actual index card that documents Dr. King's arrest with his fingerprints. Downtown, there's also a plaque a sculpture. It's one of my favorite sculptures, one of my favorite monuments that I've ever seen, Craig. It is called the Foot Soldiers Monument. And it's the only civil rights marker that's not dedicated to a person or an organization. It actually has 4 faces, 4 busts that represent the different groups that came to St. Augustine in 1963 and 1964, right? Including local people. There is now, as of, I believe it was 2013, 2014, that the city renamed where Andrew Young was beaten. Is now called Andrew Young Crossing. And it is right across the plaza. It is an extension of St. George Street, our most famous street. The path that Reverend Young walked after the beating, because he finished the march to the slave market, now they are memorialized in his literal footsteps, bronze footsteps in the concrete, with quotes from several different people, including Mohandas Gandhi, Dr. King, and Andrew Young, about the righteousness of nonviolence to bring social change. So that's unique in that you literally walk the footsteps and you look down to read the quotes. So the city has done things to commemorate this important history. I would love to see more done to draw tourist attention to those really, really important historical events. Because what happened literally in this plaza is what made America continue to be the nation we are.
Didn't something happen with Dr. Haling's dentistry office?
Yeah, Dr. Haling's dentistry office, and he becomes sort of the forgotten person, right? His home was shot into, his wife was pregnant, the place where she was sitting when she got up and the home was shot into killed the family dog. He had to send his family out of the city. He eventually left St. Augustine before the Civil Rights Act was even signed. His business was ruined, but his actual physical office is now the 40th Accord Museum, which commemorates this period in St. Augustine's history. So you can literally go to his office and see mementos and artifacts pertaining to the local struggle, particularly this history that I'm talking about. So yeah, 2 places that are of really national significance are the 40th Accord Museum and especially the Lincolnville Cultural Center.
Why is it called 40th Accord? What does that mean?
40th Accord was actually an organization that was founded to make sure at the 40th anniversary of the 1964 struggle that its legacy and leaders were not forgotten. I would say that 40th Accord actually highlighted this history at a time where highlighting this history was not socially acceptable by some people, right? So they were the ones that basically said, we have to commemorate these freedom fighters because no one else is. So the organization was 40th Accord. It's an acronym. I don't want to mess it up, but they have a website. They have an actual physical space. And they decided that it was so successful, this idea of we're going to celebrate the 40th anniversary of 64. It was so successful that they contributed to the local history by having several markers that commemorate Black history throughout Lincolnville and the St. Augustine area erected. And it was really the first time that any group had said this history is worth preserving, commemorating, and remembering.
All right. Munson Motor Lodge assault occurs the very next day the Civil Rights Act is passed. Then what happens in St. Augustine?
That's a much more complex question, because I think that what doesn't happen is that there is no compromise to include African American representatives in a position of in an official capacity, or even hiring. The laws changed. The relationship between local African Americans and city leaders did not. That's why SCLC and Andrew Young said we didn't mention St. Augustine very often because we wanted to forget about it. One of the major objectives of any SCLC local campaign was the formation of a biracial committee, right? You saw it in Birmingham, you saw it in Albany, Georgia, you saw it in Selma. A biracial committee was a city committee that had representatives from the white business community and the Black community, ministers, educators, lawyers, whatever, right? So that in the aftermath of a campaign, the next time there are tensions, the next time there are conflicts, instead of taking to the streets, it gave local Black people an avenue where they could express their grievances and ask for redress. Well, the biracial committee was promised to King, and it was actually formed. When SCLC left, every white member of the biracial committee resigned, and that committee has yet to meet to this day.
Wow.
Yeah.
You had businesses like the St. George Pharmacy that passed out surveys to its patrons that said, would you rather integrate, or would you rather preserve the jobs of 7 hardworking white families who face closure instead of bowing down to federal authority? What say you, right? The laws forced an already hostile public to open their businesses to people that they did not recognize as deserving of equal constitutional rights.
As people.
That's right. Yeah. And, I think that one of the major research projects for anyone who wants to explore it is that year after 64. I have a student now who's writing her senior seminar paper on this very topic, and she said that less than a year after, in the St. Augustine record, she found an article that was titled "St. Augustine Wants to Forget," and I think that says it all.
Do you face, as you teach students about this, do you face hostility or just people who don't know, or are there still people who don't want to know?
I think, Craig, all of the above. But the hostility that I see from students when this history is taught is hostility concerning why they didn't know this, right?
Yeah.
Our students can handle the truth. Students can handle uncomfortable truths. Students get mad if they think they have been misled, lied to, or that they have been indoctrinated by omission with a deliberate whitewashing of the past. I still have students to this day, guys, who say, I grew up in St. Johns County. They don't get mad at me.
Yeah.
They get mad at their former teachers. And you know what? They want to know more. So are there people who still say it's best left in the past? Yes. And those are the people who are afraid of education and the new generation of students that I have the unbelievable fortune of teaching, who say, never again. We are going to make sure our kids know more about this topic than we did at their age. And we're going to explain to them why it matters. And that's the thing. Is it a shameful past? Of course it is. But it's also part of the greater American narrative. I think the civil rights story is the great American success story. To a degree, we use the process to change the system. The system of inequality and Jim Crow and segregation was actually overturned through peaceful, nonviolent, democratic means. Now, we have a long way to go. Trust me, we have a long way to go. And if we don't understand that the civil rights movement is what made us who we are today, if we try to whitewash that history or ignore that history, or say that it's too uncomfortable for our students to learn, then all that does is validate injustices that continue to happen to this day. So students can handle the truth. Students have been able to handle the truth ever since I've been here. Sometimes it's the adults that have trouble coming to grips with their past.
Yeah.
And when you have a community like St. Augustine that's small, that's tight-knit, we forget that there are several African Americans who say, I thought I knew Mr. So-and-so, and I saw the way he yelled at me at these marches, the names he called me. And oh, by the way, I had to go back to living with them. I had to go back to school with their kids. And now I knew what they thought of me. Those wounds remain fresh.
Well, to your students, these are, their grandparents in the 60s. Right. We're talking about the actors in this. These people are still alive. You don't have this wonderful distance of hit. My parents weren't slave owners. How can I know? This whole thing. Well, that was the 1860s. This was the 1960s. These people are still alive. Exactly the children you were teaching, these are their grandparents. They go to Sunday dinner with these. This is fresh and raw history, and you don't have that. Well, that was so long ago. Who knows anymore? I don't remember. How can you say it wasn't written down? No, it's all there, and there's photographic evidence.
The documents are bountiful, right? I mean, the FBI was here submitting daily reports to the Jacksonville office, and students, when they get into the primary sources, you know what? They recognize some of those last names.
Well, the thing is, we ought to honor the local people who are 100%. Willing to risk everything for principle.
That's right.
Mm-hmm. And that's not hyperbole. I mean,
that's not
Greg,
hyperbole.
I mean, you're talking about risking your life. I'm gonna go on this walk at this march tonight, and I may not come back. That possibility exists. It's happened to other people. Now go do it.
As a matter of fact, one of the reasons that Dr. Haling was on the radar of some of these hate groups is because he basically made a comparison to Medgar Evers, right? So Medgar Evers in Mississippi killed in front of his own home, shot in the back by a coward. And he said, we're not going to die like Medgar Evers. We're going to protect ourselves. And all of a sudden he's a radical, right? It's all the points that y'all are making are 100% valid. This is not that long ago. And these are people who knew each other before this and had to live together afterward. How do you do that? It's not easy. Yeah. For 40 years, this city had collective amnesia about that period, and they blamed it on outside agitators and said that doesn't reflect St. Augustine. Well, it did.
Yeah.
It did.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Michael Butler, history professor at Flagler College. His book, Beyond Integration, The Black Freedom Struggle in Escambia County, Florida, 1960 to 2000. I'll put links to his social media handles and the book in the show notes. What a fascinating and enlightening conversation today, Michael. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, this is history that should not be forgotten.
It absolutely should not be, because it remains so incredibly relevant. Gentlemen, it has been an honor and a privilege. Anytime you want to talk history, you know where to come.
Okay.
Thanks, Mike.
Thanks, guys.
Wow, Craig, so much to chew on there. I want to, and boy, does it resonate today with the talk about wokeness and African American history and CRT. How you can marginalize this story as it's just Black history. It's just, it's not so.
No, this is American history. This is American, and this is Florida history too. Again, the people who are willing to risk everything to change things in their lives just amazed me. I don't think we talked specifically, but he mentioned about the Klan kidnapping Dr. Haling. They broke his fingers so he couldn't work as a dentist. I mean, just how mean is that? How incredibly awful and violent and mean. And and still he persisted.